Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy, for that lovely introduction. It's really fun to be here. As Jeremy mentioned, I was a mine student in 2018 and thought I was just spending 10 days in the woods in August. And now I have a house and a 1-year-old and my whole life's here. So it could happen to you. Consider yourself warned. It's not the worst thing. But yeah, so today I'm going to talk about, as Jeremy mentioned, I've been really excited. I've sort of jumped on the naturalistic task bandwagon recently with movie watching and story listening. I'm actually not going to talk about any of that today. I'm going to talk about what I was just chatting with Mark about, sort of the antidote to that, which is actually a series of more controlled experiments that we've been trying to do in my lab and sort of throwing it back to the 1940s and kind of Heider-Simmel style social animation, social perception in very stripped down displays. So the question that motivates this project is this idea of what makes information social, right? So in order to successfully have a social interaction, we need to recognize a social interaction as such. And that might feel sort of like silly, like obviously we can recognize social interactions, but there's not really, I don't think, a formal definition of what makes information social. So this is in contrast to visual information. So we can say any stimulus that contains light is a visual stimulus. Any stimulus that contains sound is an auditory stimulus. But what makes a stimulus social, right? And how might this vary for different individuals or different groups? There's a lot of interesting edge cases, right? So things like pareidolia, where humans are sort of primed to perceive faces, even in very much inanimate objects. This kind of tells us that, you know, maybe this question of how to define a social stimulus is not quite as straightforward, or is maybe more interesting than we might think initially. And of course, this people have sort of capitalized on this tendency of humans to kind of anthropomorphize or see social information even in otherwise non-social stimuli for many decades now, going back, I think, to Heider-Simmel 1944, which you probably learned about in intro psych. So, you know, you show people, or at least you show neurotypical people, videos of geometric shapes. There's nothing social about these shapes. They don't have faces, they don't have bodies, they don't talk, they don't do any of the other things that humans do when they act social, but people watch these videos and very robustly, you know, almost automatically kind of start to ascribe human-like beliefs, motivations, desires. They sort of start to tell a whole story about what's going on between these triangles and these circles. And as I said, most individuals, at least most neurotypical individuals, do this very robustly, almost automatically. Here are a couple more examples. These are from the 90s. So people really started capitalizing on this phenomenon as kind of a marker of social perception. So the one on the left was designed to be social. The one on the right was designed to be random. And the idea is, you know, people are quite accurate at sort of determining whether an animation is intended to be social or intended to be random. But thus far throughout their history, most of these stimuli have been kind of handcrafted or manually crafted by experimenters to look sort of obviously social or obviously random. But there's no sort of deeper set of parameters that we can say, like, this is what it's like, literally just sort of experimenters manually drawing these. And we all tend to agree that they look social or look random, but is that really kind of satisfying? Like, we want to be able to say what about this movement, you know, makes it look social. You know, as I'm sure most everybody in the room knows, these animations are also interesting because people with autism, sometimes, not always, but a lot of the time are less likely to ascribe this human-like animacy or agency or social interactions to these videos. So here's just an example from this older paper here of two kids watching, I think it was that original Heider-Simmel video. And so you can see the neurotypical child on the left is really invoking a lot of social relationships, human terms, kid, bully, he's isolating himself, he's shy, he's scared. The child with autism describes this animation in much more mechanical terms, right? So he's literally just sort of recounting the movements of the shapes. He's not ascribing this deeper theory of mind to what's going on. Right, and so these things are so robust that people have used them for a long time now as social localizers to try to localize the social brain. So the Human Connectome Project, which is a large-scale scanning effort for Healthy controls used a variant of this titer simultask where they had 5 animations intended as social and 5 intended as random, as literally a social localizer for the social regions of the brain. And so here you can see the results from that, and you probably recognize, where's my mouse? You probably recognize, your sort of canonical social brainy areas that are more active when people are watching those animations that are intended to look social versus the random ones. Okay, but one interesting feature of these stimuli that I think has been somewhat overlooked thus far in their history is that just because everybody agrees that a social interaction is taking place, or most people agree, it doesn't mean that everybody thinks the same kind of social interaction is taking place in a given video, right? So I'm going to play just a few minutes of this for reasons of time, but this is kind of a funny comedy video that illustrates that.
Hydro Symbol Project. It's the Hydro Symbol. This movie, the Boy Comes movie.
I'm gonna watch the big movie and interpret what those living shapes are doing in my own way.
Later Meinhof. Maybe starting to unfold.
The movie and workshop test.
The Rogers and Hammerstein, whoever put it together.
Right. They're starting it up. Okay, the triangle's in the box. All right, big triangle is sort of like a James Campbell thing. The one's out is out. Is assimilating with the other triangles. They're playing with each other. There's just a distance between them. Somebody was having sex with somebody.
The triangle that's already gotten trapped in a room was friends are coming to try to get not up. He did it on his own. He's an independent woman. He's not supposed to go outside and play until he does his chores, but the homies came over.
It seems like he's like aggressively yelling at her. And he definitely has like gross alcohol breath right now. And I think it's not a thing.
They're having fun. They're gonna go to a bar. They might go see a Laker game. Tickets are too expensive.
So I think what I'm saying is that the little triangle and the circle are having an affair. He's pushing back and the circle is sneaking inside of the box.
So that rectangle's kind of like the limelight in the early 90s, the nightclub, and everyone's trying to get in. So they're arguing. Meanwhile, the circle just sneaks her way in. The circle's sort of like Chloe Sevigny, but when she first came out, not like now when it's sort of the atmosphere.
All right. I can share this video if you all are interested in watching the full extent of it. But yeah, I think that does a really nice job of illustrating. I mean, obviously they're playing it up a little bit, but they're all telling different stories, right? So we all potentially see different things in these animations. Just a little data to convince you of this more scientifically. So this was a pilot experiment we ran several years ago now, but we showed one of these sort of more modern animations to a bunch of people online. If you ask people to just sort of rate the extent to which they think the shapes are interacting versus moving randomly, you can see people are basically at ceiling. So pretty much everyone agrees that there's some kind of interaction going on. But if you ask people to tell a story about what's happening, you get really different responses. So here are some sample responses here. There's lots of things you can do with this text data, but one quick and easy thing is to run it through a sentiment analysis and just kind of quantify the extent to which people were speaking about this interaction in more positive versus more negative language. And you can see, in contrast to the fact that people agree that social interaction is present, they have a lot of variability in the nature of the interaction that they perceive, at least on this valence spectrum. Okay, so we have gotten, just really interested in sort of how individuals make sense of these animations and how they do so differently. In a first stab at trying to look at this, we turned to the Human Connectome Project data that has all of the, they have a large number of people, sort of a small number of actual stimuli. But just to briefly introduce this data set, this is the social cognition task. We're using data from 860 healthy young adults here. As I mentioned, there were 10 total animations, so it was a short experiment. This is part of many tasks that the HEP was running. 5 of the animations were intended to look mental, as they called them. Those are their terms, not ours. And 5 were intended to look random. The trial structure was people would watch this animation, and then they would have 3 seconds to make a response as to whether they thought the animation was depicting a social interaction or not, or if they were unsure. So for this project, just a little bit of terminology. So we're referring to the experimenter assigned label. So the intended category of the animation is mental and random. But in this analysis, we are taking this perspective that socialness is in the eye of the beholder. So you're not classifying animations by what the experimenters intended them to look like, but rather by what people actually reported perceiving. These three possible responses here. So just a little bit of analysis of the behavioral data before we get into the neuroimaging results. We found that there was a slight but pretty convincing behavioral bias towards social responses. So, these were intended to be balanced 5 and 5, but there was a slight tendency for people to declare things social more than non-social. And social responses were also slightly faster than non-social responses. And I think we're probably not the first people to notice this, but I think it sort of fits with this idea that, we're primed to perceive social interactions. I think evolutionarily, there's probably a larger cost of missing a social interaction versus having a false alarm. So you want to sort of always correctly recognize when somebody is trying to interact with you, and that might bias you to kind of see socialness and things that are not, rather than miss socialness and things that are. We can formalize that idea with signal detection analysis that also kind of corroborates this. So if we take the intended experimenter labels as kind of the ground truth, and then we look at people's tendency to either correctly detect or have false alarms or have omission errors, we see this slight bias towards false alarms of calling something social that's not intended to be so. We can also look at the percentage of unsure responses. So we see that people are more likely to say that they're not sure when it's an animation intended to be random. And we think that's because it's a sort of reluctance to fully declare, to fully rule out the possibility of socialness, right? People are sort of staying in that unsure zone because they don't want to be like, it's definitely not social, right? So these were, just some interesting behavioral data. I'm going to skip over this for reasons of time. There were some sort of weak trait correlations with that too, but this was, as I said, a healthy sample, so it's harder to look at. There's less variability in terms of psychiatric conditions and things like that. So next we wanted to turn to the neuroimaging data, and these stimuli, so in some ways this was not the best data set to look at this question in, because there were only 10 stimuli and they were handcrafted, as I said, to be obvious. So like, the experimenters are sort of banking on the fact that most people get everything correct, classifying social as social, random as non-social. And for the most part, that was true. So here, what I'm showing is the 10 different animations with their kind of silly names here, and then the percentage of responses. And so you can see these first 5 animations were the ones that were intended to be social. And you can see, in fact, these big red bars indicate that most people got it right, so to speak. Same thing for the non-social stimuli, but there was enough variability that we could sort of tease out those behavioral responses that I just showed you. And then for the neuroimaging data, we started with this single animation. So this one was called random mechanical. It was intended to look random. And as you can see, most people called it random, but actually almost 100 people in this data set got a social percept from this animation. And so even though that's not a huge number percentage-wise, it's a pretty big number in absolute terms for neuroimaging experiments. So we focused on this single video, and when we contrast brain activity between people that reported this animation to be social versus people that reported it non-social, we see that a ton of the brain is more active in people that thought they were perceiving a social interaction in this video, right? And this is kind of cool because the visual input is exactly the same. This is the identical stimulus shown to different people. And if we just group people by what percept they got from this, we see that the people that did see a social interaction have more activity almost everywhere. And if we look across all animations, we can also leverage these unsure responses to get a sort of vaguely parametric idea of which brain regions might be responding parametrically to sort of the amount of social evidence. So if we do this kind of 2-part contrast where we look for regions that are most active in the people that responded social, sort of intermediately active in the people that responded unsure, and least active in the people that responded non-social, we can pick up on a subset. So I don't know where my pointer, here it is, a subset of the regions that we found in this first analysis that sort of show this kind of parametric response to degree of social evidence, let's say. These are just some sample time courses from those three responses. And you can see these are sort of building in the beginning, and then by the end, the people that respond social have more activity in all of these regions. So the brain cares about social stuff. We're not the first to show that, but we think it's kind of cool that with that identical visual input, we're able to differentiate based on people's conscious percepts. Another way we can look at this, especially given that, again, this data set was not the perfect one because performance was overall quite good. So there was not as much variability as we might have hoped for, but nonetheless, we can do something where we just kind of look at brain activity in these different regions and see if we can better model that activity when we take the sort of ground truth, the experimenter labels versus the observer reports. So what people actually reported seeing. And so the pink areas are better explained by people's actual conscious percepts. The green areas are better explained by the experimenter labels. So you can see that in a lot of places, the ground truth is really in the eye of the beholder, we think. Okay, let me skip this. Cool. So we thought this was kind of a good start. Pandemic project capitalizing on existing data, but the HCP stimuli were not particularly ambiguous or well controlled, right? They were just these manually crafted stimuli from the 90s that some experimenter dragged the triangle around and tried to tell a story. So we wanted to try to do a bit better with this. So our next and current goal is to develop a set of stimuli that are fully parameterized to let us rigorously investigate if and how social interactions are perceived and how these percepts vary across individuals. So another really nice feature of these stimuli, I mentioned this was a kind of antidote to the more fully naturalistic side of the lab. We can have really tight control over the visual properties of these stimuli, right? So unlike having to make your own films, which is fun, but really time consuming and expensive, we can actually generate these stimuli programmatically, and that lets us kind of get a fully parameterized suite of videos that we are controlling on the back end, and we can sort of titrate them up or down to look more or less social and try to get individual, as we call them, tuning curves for, how much evidence people need to declare something social. So I want to mention, I should have said this before, all of the HCP work was led by my fabulous postdoc, Dr. Reka Vario. She's also been leading this next arm of the project with a lot of support from other folks in the lab, Tori, Jordan, and Pam. Okay, so Stefan, so probably look familiar to you. Hopefully it'll look familiar to some of you as well. Yeah, so we were not the first, again, to have this idea of leveraging these really simple stimuli to try to look at the psychophysics of social interaction. So this is a really inspirational paper to us, published by Tao Gao and Brian Scholl's lab almost 15 years ago now, where they were looking at this and trying to characterize the psychophysics of chasing. So they came up with this cool approach where basically if you have two agents on the screen, one of them is chasing the other. They call them the wolf and the sheep. We sometimes call them the predator and the prey. I'll use those terms interchangeably. But basically one really easy parameter to control that also has a big effect on people's percepts is just to control the angle around which the wolf is allowed to deviate when it's seeking the sheep. So if you could imagine these two circles moving around the screen, the sheep is sort of trying to get away from the wolf. The wolf is chasing the sheep with some level of directness, right? So an angle of 0 would mean that the wolf is always making a direct beeline for the sheep. If you allow the wolf to sort of deviate around that a little bit, you get this sort of more subtle chase, right? And so that's what they're showing here. So they're showing that as you increase that subtlety of the chase, people are less accurate at detecting who is doing the chasing or if a chasing is occurring. And so they showed this at the group level, and we thought this would be a cool place to start to see if this group average curve also sort of differs across different individuals. So we have some software now that allows us to recreate some of these stimuli. So I'll just play these for you. These are 3 different videos that vary in that chase subtlety angle. Okay, so that one I think is pretty obvious. Black dot looks to be chasing the gray dot. I'll play you a slightly more subtle one. Anybody get a? Yeah, gray's following black. I think that one's pretty clear too, although it's a little more subtle. And then here's the last one. Anybody know? I think this one is actually what we call wander. So neither of them is chasing, they're just sort of moving randomly. Yeah, but you could see how, as we sort of dial up that ambiguity, different people might start to get different ideas of what's going on. So that's where we're starting with these stimuli. And so
How is the ship, I mean, how is the ship moving?
like, how is it programmed? Or
I mean, the valve you have angle by the ship, how do you define the ship?
yeah, so we played around with it. You can just sort of have the sheep move randomly. It turns out that the videos work a bit better if the sheep is like slightly programmed somewhat to try to avoid the wolf. So you can actually dial up and down the sheep parameter too. So like one option would just be to have the sheep not even aware of the wolf and just doing whatever, and then the wolf is aware of the sheep. In practice, the wolf tends to catch the sheep really quickly that way. So we add another little parameter to the sheep that tells it to sort of loosely try to avoid the wolf so that we can get sort of longer paths out of it. Yeah. Good question. Okay. We have a control condition for this where, so Stefan brought up a good point. This was a control actually that they had in the original Gao paper as well. So it could be the case that people are just picking up on correlated motion between the shapes. So when the sheep makes a turn, the wolf also makes a turn, right? Is it really the fact that it's chasing, getting closer to the shape, or is it just sort of this correlated motion pattern? So Gao and Gao cleverly controlled for that with this mimic condition where the predator actually chases a mirror image reflection of the prey. So I'll show you what that looks like. Participants would only see the circles, but here we're plotting the mirror image prey with this gray triangle. And that's what the predator is trying to chase. I forget if the predator is black or gray in this video, but let's see. Yeah, so the predator is trying to chase the black dot is trying to chase the gray triangle, which is doing this sort of mirror image reflection of what the prey is doing. And then, as I mentioned, we have this wander condition where there's no, theoretically no correlation between the two agents' movements, and they both just kind of wander on the screen. I think it's a diagonal. I think it's actually a moving, it's not directly in the middle of the screen. I should have looked back at this for this, I can't, but it's some axis that is sort of following the prey around. It's not like perfectly in the middle. Yeah. Okay. So we showed these to a bunch of people online. They watched one of these videos. They're all 5 seconds in length, and then they just do this continuous rating scale where they rate the extent to which they thought there was some kind of follow interaction. We're using follow here because we thought it was a little more neutral than chase. Chase kind of evokes some potentially aggressive or hostile. So, and then, yeah, we've actually had a lot of conversations about what the other end of this scale should be looking at. That's tricky. I can talk about that more. But for now, we gave people this scale of follow to random because we were sort of trying to mimic what HCP had done. And then we also asked people after they give us that rating to identify the predator. So just as sort of a measure of accuracy, and this gives some interesting results even when people don't report seeing a social interaction. They sometimes are correctly able to identify the follower. Okay, yeah, so online behavioral experiments. Each subject is 6 trials per subtlety level. So there's, I think, 84 trials, including the wander trials and the control mimic trial. And they do these 2 questions, the continuous perceived report and the predator identification. So you can see at the group level, we really nicely replicate this curve that Gao reported. So in the black line, we have the follow stimuli, where the chase is actually visible to the participants. And you can see that as we increase the subtlety level, people are less likely to call that a following interaction. In our control condition, that was not the case, as we hoped and expected. So that was nice to see. And then if we look at accuracy, we see sort of a similar trend, although interestingly, even at these higher subtlety levels where people don't necessarily report, I mean, obviously they're reporting some degree of a social present, but they're kind of below the 50% line, but they're still actually quite accurate at determining or guessing who the predator was. So this is group level results. We are more interested in the individual variability. So here I'm just showing you a sample of several subjects. So you can see everybody sort of shows this general pattern, but there's also differences in how that curve looks across people. These are fairly reliable. So we brought everybody back for a second session, and here you can just sort of compare visually. The first row is session 1, the second row is session 2. I think it was about 2 weeks later, so not a super long interval, but decent interval, and you can see that these shapes kind of visually look fairly consistent within subject. We can quantify this with ICCs, interclass correlation coefficients, which are pretty good. They're not great, but they're sort of in the 0.5, sometimes 0.6 range, depending on the subtlety level. So this was kind of cool because this is a trait-like, I suppose, marker for kind of how sensitive people are to this dose of evidence for socialness. How am I doing on time? I can, okay, there were some trait correlations, but they weren't that exciting. But cool. We have started scanning with these stimuli. We're in the very early stages. Actually, we're not anymore. My slides are out of date. I just need to update this. But yeah, so we've started trying an fMRI experiment with folks here. It's also 2 session studies. We can look at things like reliability. This is from a couple of months, an early cohort that we analyzed. So here is activity in response to the different conditions, follow versus mimic, and then this sort of the subtlety variables. So these are the things we're calling sort of objective socialness, like we as the experimenters are kind of determining if this should look social, and if so, how social it should look. This is activity to subjective socialness, or what people actually reported seeing in terms of how social things looked, and there's a lot of activity, interestingly, in sort of this V5 motion detector area that scales more so with how social people reported perceiving these animations to be, rather than the sort of direct objective socialness that we were controlling on the back end. So these are quite preliminary. If people are interested, have more updated results. But yeah, our interim findings so far with this project, we're replicating Gao et al., showing that varying a simple parameter, this chase subtlety parameter, reveals these group level similarities, but also some idiosyncrasies in social perception that are excitingly at least somewhat reliable. And even when we're controlling for the overall motion in the video and the task conditions, so sort of this control versus experimental condition, the subjective ratings are the ones that best explain activity in a lot of the brain. Yeah, so we're continuing to work with this data set, which is now complete. I think we have 21, 22 subjects scanned twice each. So we're going to do more exciting stuff with like multivariate analyses and single trial data and things like that. Okay, and so with the remaining, I'll try to wrap up quickly, but just to give you sort of a broader feel for where we want to go with this project, we're kind of thinking about these individual tendencies as social perception landscapes. And so what I mean by that is if you think of sort of a space in which a given stimulus might fall, you kind of have these 2 axes, or there's probably much more than 2, but we're thinking about it in terms of 2 for the time being. So in order to successfully have an interaction, you first need to classify whatever you're seeing as social or not, right? So that's sort of the X, or the horizontal axis here. It goes from not social to social. And then within the space of social interactions, you can have a different nature of that interaction, right? So you can have things that are more positive or more negative. There are many other dimensions, obviously, on which interactions can vary. So you can imagine sort of building out this space into many more dimensions. But the key idea here is the horizontal axis is sort of if a social interaction is present, and the vertical axis is the nature of that interaction to the extent that it's present. And so you can kind of think of this as like a healthy control landscape. And then so then the axes would also be kind of like these objective parameters that we can control. And then people's percepts depend on their sort of landscape for how different things get weighted. And then One idea might be that these landscapes get sort of warped in different psychiatric conditions. So you can imagine a condition where people are just less sensitive to the presence of a social interaction, so that x-axis kind of gets compressed, so they need a lot more evidence, let's say, to start declaring something as social. I don't know how well this is coming through on this screen, but that's sort of supposed to be represented by this larger gray area here until you finally get to that sort of detection threshold for a social interaction. Something like depression might be characterized by this negativity bias, where more of this landscape is deemed negative. So even interactions that other people might perceive as neutral or even positive, people with depression might be more likely to perceive those as a negative interaction. And then finally, you might be able to think of something like psychosis as a higher sensitivity. So sort of the opposite of autism, in the sense that a lot of things get classified as social that are not actually intended to be social. So this is the idea of like paranoia, like I'm sort of reading messages or seeing people being kind of like out to get me in ways that aren't really true. So I have this sort of hyperactive social signal detection system. And then I'm also potentially more likely to view those as negative interactions. And so we're trying to kind of, in parallel, build out interesting or find interesting parameters that govern valence percept. So one kind of interesting dimension that we're looking at is playing versus fighting. So if you think about the sort of classic picture of playing and fighting, they both kind of involve two agents like moving apart and then coming together, maybe in quick succession or in this sort of stereotyped way. But depending on sort of their speed or other features of their movement, things might look more playful or more aggressive. And so we've been playing around with a parameter that we call charge speed, which just governs how fast the shapes move when they kind of come together. So I'll very quickly play you a couple demo videos for that. So who thinks that looks more like playing? And who thinks it looks more like fighting? Okay, some variability, but this is a lower charge speed. So most people get a more sort of playful percept from that video. I'll play you the intermediate one. What do people think about that one? Still more playful. Jeremy's a little unsure. All right. I think most people still see this as somewhat playful, but maybe a little less so than the first one. And then yeah, see, I get a sort of like annoyed. I feel like these are like siblings or ones like kind of trying to annoy the other one, but that's still, I guess, negative in a sense. But that's what I mean. Like there's a lot of different axes going on. But it's a lot of fun because we can, just vary these like pretty simple parameters. We can also control like how much time they spend apart, how much they sort of just like stay in contact versus do these little quick, So we have a whole software that lets us play around with this. And this is just some brief preliminary data from the play versus fight stuff. So our manipulation works in the sense that as we increase that charge speed, people start to perceive more fighting than playing. These individual curves are a bit noisier, but we also see some interesting variability in these sort of tuning curves to the play fight spectrum. So wrapping up, we have a lot we want to do with this arm of the lab. So we are really excited about running these in sort of an interactive version where participants themselves are controlling one of the agents. And one hypothesis that we have is people might become more sensitive to so people might sort of start to detect a chase, let's say at a lower dose, so like a higher chase subtlety, if they are actually the one being chased versus if they're watching it in a more third person scenario. We can also hopefully soon start doing situations where both agents are controlled by the players, but that introduces, obviously we lose all control, but it's interesting. We are thinking about sort of doing reaction time tasks for drift diffusion modeling, kind of picking up on those ideas of just social signal detection in the first place. Our ultimate goal is to try to string together multiple behaviors to create longer and more complex narratives that are still fully parameterized. And just as a quick plug, I'm actually hiring for this project at the grad student and the postdoc level. So if you or anyone you know is interested, reach out. And also if anyone, I didn't do a formal pitch for this project, but we do have our software mostly up and running. And so you can install it and kind of play around with generating these videos, or if you want to, yeah, just mess around with any of these ideas, get in touch. Thank you very much to everyone in my lab who led this project, and thanks for listening. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mean, I think I'll go back to the slide that I skipped. That's a really interesting effect. And I mean, one explanation is just sort of like attentional gain, like once people, because the stimuli were long. So the HTTP stimuli were 20 seconds long. And so we're modeling that basically just as a block. Actually, we model it as a sort of building like slow progressor. But like it could be the case that once people decide the thing is social, they're just paying more attention to it, right? It's some sort of like attentional gain thing. So I think what Jerry's talking about is, yeah. So there's like there's a lot more activity even in sort of like pre-occipital V1E regions in people that respond social. So it could be like just sort of some attentional thing, like once the decision that something is social is made somewhere else in the brain, then you're just kind of like paying more attention to it. But we tried to, I mean, this is like it's really hard to look at like time courses with fMRI, obviously because the bulk response is super slow. But we tried to kind of do this analysis where we looked time point by time point and looked to see like when activity between social and non-social responders diverges in the course of the video. And if you believe what we did here, again, it's not the easiest way to look at this in, but we so here the regions are colored by when they started to show a difference between social and non-social responders. The purple areas showed a difference earlier on. And so there's a bit of a mix. I mean, you see this kind of purple region here in prefrontal cortex, but you also see that some of these, well, these are, I guess, more later on in the ventral stream, but like some of these visual regions are diverging pretty early. I think we would probably need like EEG or MEG to look at this more convincingly. But yeah, we're really interested in like how much of this effect is sort of like a bottom up versus top down. And yeah.
In parts of the data, you have like for specific stimuli, you have like ambiguous situation. Like sometimes say yes, there's a chasing, or there's no chasing. So still within participant with the same type of stimuli, you can also do kind of classification to see where is the brain area that is like doing its job.
Yeah.
Where does that information diverge? Like when do you make this kind of decision? And since you're talking about if there is a social interaction type of that, is it hierarchical or it's kind of parallel?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're hoping to get at with this newer fMRI data set that we collected ourselves, where we have the same individuals doing like 84 trials where, you know, we're sort of varying parametrically, we got social evidence and then looking at their responses. So those are exactly the types of questions we're hoping to answer. Craig is hard at work at analyzing this data right now, so stay tuned.
Yeah, I love this work.
Thank you.
Clear with the like phase data set from Tim 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering.
Ones that we get in those kinds of settings where there's like some, I mean, basically a larger space of goals. You have some desires where there's kind of like there's a wall so you can see somebody, or you know, you might have false beliefs where you like see somebody and then you move away and then you do something else. And like whether that would look, and that's all like parameterized, you know, like generated synthetic things as well, where you can like tunes knobs, right, of like how it's just different parameters using like that physics engine, instead of like, choosing that over this. And I was just wondering like how you see the spectrum between this and that.
Totally. Yeah, that work is really beautiful and we've been following it for a long time. It's interesting because I think they often, I don't know if they often use triangles, which is like, I think, yeah, people have shown this. But even just like using a triangle automatically makes things look more social because especially if you have it oriented like to the axis that's moving. So we actually deliberately use circles to kind of, you know, dial back or make the starting point a bit more neutral. But yeah, I mean, I think they are doing really beautiful like parameterization of that stuff. But I think we were sort of trying to get at even this earlier question of just like what makes something social in the first place, right? And they're sort of starting from a place of assuming like, okay, this is social, like what is going on? Yeah, like we're just going to take for granted that this is social interaction. What are this agent's goals? What are this other agent's goals? And like how does that evolve? And so I think our goal with these even further stripped down stimuli is to kind of like go a step or two even back from that. But ultimately, I think, yeah, we want this work to kind of intersect with that. And that's why if we can sort of build up from these like really early first principles and try to, I don't know, come at it from different ends of the spectrum, that's the ultimate goal. Tessa, yes.
Yeah, it's great work. Thank you so much. I was actually wondering when you're talking about like what is social, I always wonder with these animations, is it like they are social in the sense that there are two dots moving together in a directed way or not? And how much of that also is just the fact that you think that one of them is intentional or goal directed in a way? And could you have the same kind of social perspective if you had one dot, but it's somehow acting intentional in some way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm looking at Ashton because he has come to a bunch of our lab meetings on this and given us really helpful input. Yeah, it's initially we were hoping to kind of divorce the ideas of like socialness from animacy. We didn't do a great job with that by having random as the other end of the spectrum, because you could imagine a situation where people see the two dots and believe that they're each behaving animately, but they're just not interacting with each other. And then it's like, well, do I call that random or do I call it, you know? And so we've run a few follow-ups now where we give people kind of multiple sliders. So we give people a slider from like not alive to alive, and then from like interacting to not interacting, to try to tease out. It's really hard to tease out animacy from socialness. I guess I naively assumed that like if two agents are having a social interaction, they have to be animate. But now I actually feel like with AI and computer, like there's actually like a non-trivial percentage of people when we gave them those two sliders that would say these things are not animate, but they are having a social interaction, or vice versa. Like these things are animate, but they're not socially interacting. And so I think it's really tricky. I mean, I think our primary interest is not necessarily in animacy, it's more in social interactions, but wording that in a way that captures what people are actually perceiving is really tricky. And we're still trying to get a handle on like, can we even divorce those two? Is that even meaningful? Should we be trying to do that? Should we just be looking at like sort of two axes of it? But yeah. Yeah.
It'd be very cool if you could learn what latent parameterizations of these makes an individual see something as social, and then potentially like manipulate the context in which they are seeing those things. Like you tell them these are automata that have been designed with these parameters. Does the brain activity still look like that person can see nothing in a sort of way? Or like you're saying, like these are AI agents that have been designed this way, or these are bacteria that are alive, but maybe that's not social. And is there some divorce between like the way that the brain is processing social information to report whether things are social or not?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. And like that's sort of yet another parameter on which people might vary is like their context sensitivity, right? And like are some people just like primed to perceive socialism in these like really boring gray and black dots, or like, but then if we give them a context, is that like how much gain does that sort of buy you? And like that's, yeah, I mean, we'd love to get there at some point. And yeah, I think the ultimate goal would be to try to build like a model for each person of like, you know, given this person and their sort of like trait or state-like qualities, and then also given the features of the stimulus and the context in which we show it to them, like can we sort of predict how social the person will perceive that stimulus and also the nature of the interaction they perceive.
Do that. And feeding that back into a generative model that's able to like on the fly generate stimulated.
Totally. I think that's sort of the next frontier with this. I mean, we wanted to start with something really, and this is just sort of gets back to this like antidote to the naturalistic stuff. Like I wanted something really interpretable that like I can control, and I knew exactly what it was, what we were varying. But yeah, I think absolutely there's also a lot of room to do this in a like generative framework and then try to like pull out what the meaningful features are that I mean we don't even need to, I don't know, but
Yeah.
there's something satisfying as well, like knowing. I see.
All generative model.
I see.
Generating new stimuli, and you know how people are going to interpret this new stimuli.
Yeah, that would be super cool. Should we, I can hang around too if you guys need to.
We need one more, then we'll break.
Okay. I think hang on, sorry, I can hang out. Interesting. I get, yeah, can you say a little more about what you mean? So like the subjective experience, like just kind of like how it makes people feel, or like.
I know that you have.
I see. Yeah. I mean, yeah, great questions. One thing we've talked about doing, which we should probably just do sooner rather than later, is like just sort of pull together a bunch of like the more classic social kind of like, I don't know, like things like emotion recognition or some of like the classic like social cognition tasks, and just like put them into a big battery along with this task, and you know, mTurk or prolific it, and then like have people come back and like look at how behavior on our task here kind of relates to behavior on other like more classic social, this is I guess classic in the sense it's highly reasonable, but you know, we're sort of making these tuning curves out of it, and how like how does someone's tuning curve like relate to their performance or their accuracy or whatever on other social cognition tasks, and how does that how are things differentially reliable? That's something we'd like to do hopefully pretty soon, because yeah, like I guess one of our goals with going down this road in the first place was trying to develop a better social cognition task that captures more individual variability, but that's still reliable variability. So rather than doing these like HTTP style, everybody's at ceiling, it's just this kind of like tried and true task that activates regions in the exact same way across people. Like, yeah, like getting that, being in that more ambiguous zone, which allows for more variability, but still hopefully having it be like reliable and meaningful. So yeah, we don't know yet, but stay tuned.
Thanks, let's thank you.